Today I have read a fascinating new book that I wish to share with you, Christianity's American Fate. It traces the history of Christianity in the US and explains today's ideological diversity. So, when immigrants came, they formed parish communities. The church was their locus, their identity, their community. And these were all relatively parochial until the late 19th century. Even private universities were organized around one particular faith. But then things changed in the 20th century, and there was a growing division between ecumenical faith and evangelical. Ecumenicals became increasingly liberal, universalist, tolerant, and open-minded and scientific, whereas evangelicals became increasingly conservative and indeed racist. 81% voted for Trump in 2016. So how did this happen? Well, Hollinger points to three important conditions: Jews, missionaries, and universities. That transformed the evangelical faith. So by 1920, about 25% of New Yorkers were Jewish, and these people were incredibly educated, and they did very well in philosophy and psychology, in films too, and this helped transform culture in terms of people recognized their talents and they built a more secular, liberal, open-minded worldview. People didn't just see themselves as Christian, they increasingly fraternized. And this idea and the Jewish dominance of psychology, for example, showed that therapy could be an alternative form of personal aid rather than, say, prayer. And the influence in philosophy is to push for a sort of more liberal way of understanding the world. Also, what I didn't know is that so many feminists in the 1970s were Jewish. Dworkin, Brown-Miller, Steinem, all Jewish. So this is pushing for, and it is a de-Christianization of ecumenical faith, especially in places like New York. Another important factor was missionaries. In the 1920s, for example, some ecumenical churches would spend 90% of their funds on missionaries. And those missionaries returned and wrote books about the people that they met in Asia, for example. And that fostered tolerance and, empathy, an understanding of other people with similar desires and beliefs and should be recognized in their own right, regardless of that faith. So ecumenical churches became much more open-minded because their missionaries had gone abroad and had shared these ideas about different people. And then on top of that, in ecumenical faith, people increasingly went to universities, they shared diverse views. And so they increasingly, over the 20th century, these ecumenical faiths, like the Federation Council of Churches, which then became the National Council of Churches, those supported a range of progressive struggles, such as the anti-Vietnam War, such as the Civil Rights Movement, all those movements supported by the ecumenical faith, which was increasingly liberal, progressive, tolerant, and universalist. And they even supported pushes for decolonial things. Okay? Meanwhile, evangelicals remain more focused on individual salvation, the belief that the Armageddon, the rapture is coming, and a strict adherence to the literal interpretation of the Bible, and also a racist interpretation, the Curse of Ham, for example. And this was then seized upon by Republicans, as we know, in their Long South strategy, especially Reagan, who, launched his campaign on the ground where the KKK had killed people, and he pushed for states' rights against, the federal interference, which many racists clung to because they saw this as, protection of segregation, etc. And so the evangelicals in the South, now increasingly courted by the Republicans, remained in this more sort of anti-scientific, anti-liberal, racist worldview. And that was partly funded by oil wealth, for example, and increasingly courted by Republicans. And so they remained under this sort of canopy, this homogenous canopy of a worldview which is anti-scientific. Meanwhile, then, now ecumenical Christians and also Catholics and of course Jews became increasingly secular. So now in 2021, 29% of Americans were secular. So those people from the ecumenical tradition had left their faith. They had become much more secular, and they had carried with them those universalist, democratic, scientific ideas that were previously adopted by the ecumenical churches. And so that is a story, a fantastic story, about America's ideological diversity today. I enjoyed it. So did the puppy, I think, but he's a little tired.